And now we're going to talk about the other part of the project, which was about viral safety and viral risks. And the reason why we thought about including this part, or one of the motivations. Okay, one of the motivations why we thought about including this element here was because dating apps have for a long time been discussed in terms of health and risks for HIV, for sexual health, also the risks of scamming and harassment. And we thought it was really interesting to figure out how app users and the apps themselves were mobilizing this knowledge during the time of COVID, because it was a different sort of viral risk. We also have the issue of chemsex, which is on the rise as a narrative around dating apps. But at the same time, over the past, I would say 5-10 years, dating apps have become increasingly involved in promoting health, particularly sexual health, particularly things like HIV testing, PrEP and reminders, STI testing and prevention. So there was a lot happening in the health and dating app intersection that also coincided with the surge in dating app use during COVID. So there were many approaches to safety on the apps during COVID. Some apps shut down entirely and did not allow people to access the features that would allow them to meet others. The vast majority developed some bespoke interventions that may be pop-ups, it may be messages, it may be reminders. Some of them did so in collaboration with community organizations or academics, particularly in the US and here in the UK in collaboration with Prepster. And overall, there was a negotiation, and this is something we've come already close to discussing today several times, between apps being businesses whose main goal is to make money, but also wanting to be seen as responsible biosexual citizens. And by this, we mean as responsible actors in the landscape of sexual health. They wanted to be perceived as doing something and doing something positive in the context of COVID, as they have been seen or as they want to be seen in other contexts like HIV and sexual health. When we talked to people about how they managed COVID in dating apps, there were quite a few approaches. For many users, they essentially told us, I didn't meet with anyone. For example, Clara said that the vast majority of people on dating sites didn't want to meet. It was just chatting and talking, and there wasn't an expectation that you would meet in person. Again, going back to the rhythms and the patterns. The reasons why people didn't want to meet were varied. In some cases, like Jadid, there was an element of concern and a feeling of responsibility for other people in their close circle, right? So he argued that he was reluctant to meet because he might come into contact with vulnerable members in their family, like their aunties who are really vulnerable. Other people told us things like they didn't feel like meeting up because there was so much death and fear going around that kind of curtailed both their emotional bandwidth and their libido. So that was a general sense that we got from people, that they didn't want to meet up. But other people did use apps to meet, and that is the truth. So for example, Eric says that in most cases, people would not be explicit about the desire to meet through dating apps during COVID, but there would be ways of letting other people know, vague wordings, hints, ways of putting text in their profiles or in their usernames. But it was extremely vague. We wanted to figure out whether there was a way to measure this. And the reason why we included this in the survey was because quite early during COVID, there was a paper that came out, whose author I don't remember, but it was an author, that argued that gay men were more likely to breach lockdown regulations in order to satisfy sociosexual needs around casual sex and casual intimacy. And the paper, which it was a good paper, was picked up by quite a few outlets that said essentially gay men are reckless. So we wanted to figure out, actually, are people breaching lockdown regulations? And we developed this kind of question. 3 of these questions do qualify as potentially having breached lockdown regulations, right? So the one is attending and taking part in face-to-face social meetings organized through dating apps, going in-person dates organized through dating apps, and then meeting people for sex whom you had found through dating apps. And the wording of both the options and the question itself is quite vague because we didn't want our ethics board to think that we were asking people to reveal criminal behavior and shut down the whole thing. So we worked around the phrasing. But essentially those three questions, if they answered yes, they might have been considered to be in breach of lockdown regulations. We asked about the frequency in which they did this, but the analysis we are going to present now is based essentially on yes or no. If they selected that they met or that they did any of those things in any kind of frequency, they count as yes. If they say never, they count as no. So overall, 73.5% of participants might have breached lockdown regulations. And you can see that we're comparing in this table the frequency with which they were using dating apps, which was another question which we asked, and whether they breached lockdown policy, no or yes. What we find here is that the more frequently they use dating apps, the more likely they would be to report breaching lockdown regulations. It is important to say that we cannot establish any sort of causal argument when we look at this table or this data. It is just as possible that people were really interested in meeting other people, and that's why they use dating apps, and not necessarily that they were using dating apps and that's what led them to meet other people. But we want to complicate this image somewhat and say, actually, yes, you were meeting other people, but were you taking precautions when you were doing so? And we ask this other question. During COVID lockdowns and strict social distancing regulations, when you met people on apps from outside your household for sex, dates, or friends, did you take any precautions? I didn't take any, didn't meet anyone, took some precautions, or prefer not to say. And 69.8% of people who said they had breached lockdown regulations said that they took precautions when meeting for sex, 76.4% when meeting for dates, and 75.3% when meeting for friends. These are numbers based on the number of people who breached lockdown regulation, not the whole survey sample. There was no statistically significant association between the frequency of using dating apps and the likelihood of reporting taking precautions. So we need to look at these numbers on their own in a way. But it's important to complicate the image that people were using dating apps to meet others and breaching lockdown regulations because people were also taking precautions when doing those things. And how did they navigate these precautions? And Catherine Trongley at UCL talks about COVID labor and the labor that it takes to navigate COVID and safety with other people. So in some cases, these were explicit negotiations. So Simon says that he was really concerned about it and that he wanted to make sure and have explicit conversations with people about whether they have been vaccinated, whether they had been wearing masks, where they would sit so that they could be 6 feet apart, etc. Leo equally says it was a deal breaker if the person wasn't vaccinated or had COVID, and it was a really concern for them. But in many cases, these these conversations were implicit. So for example, Barry says that it was just hinted on, do what is best for you. And Mia says that wasn't something that would be brought up, that would rely on the kind of trust established with people through conversations. And we go back here again to this idea of trust and risk that we were talking before. And an environment in which people perceive there being so much risk around scamming and harassment and impersonation, but now relying on that sense of trust built through conversation and dialogical intimacy to feel that that other person is safe. And we can talk about HIV and how this has already been reported in how gay men in particular navigate HIV, etc. And this trust is really complicated because Roy points to an issue that is prevalent when we talk about dating apps, which is a lack of verification. So Roy says, people can put on their profiles that they have been double jabbed, so they had 2 COVID vaccines, but it doesn't mean they actually have. They're not going to show their COVID passport. And what Roy is pointing here is to an issue that many users complained about, which was that dating apps were not taking what they felt were sufficient steps to verify that the information that people were putting was actually true. And in this case, it applies to COVID, but in many other cases, it might have applied to their pictures, their age, their HIV status, many other things. But this concern with trust and the fact that people felt it was an issue may have been valid in some cases. We had one participant called Paul, who, as you can see, looks very sketchy in the picture, who said that in the beginning, you had to project that you were a bit scared of COVID at staff to give them the impression that you hadn't been taking risks, so that then they would agree to meet with you. He was just one participant, but it does show a degree in which this sense of trust can work both ways and can both serve for people to feel safe and for other people to take advantage of other users. And apps did have a role in all this process, right? If we look at apps as being not just facilitators of these encounters, but mediators, they transform how people engage with each other. They also had a role in risk management. So for example, Emilia talks about how when you signed up, you had to click and accept some terms, a set of rules, including please follow social distancing guidelines. And there were different levels of different apps taking different approaches to how strict they would enforce these things and how much information they would push out to people. The reason why different apps took very varied approaches is because, as Mark said, they had to walk a very fine line. There were some kind of prompts, Mark recalls. They were saying, be safe and be sensible. And at the same time, they had to be careful because they perpetuate on the basis that, on the fact that people want to meet. And if they become too authoritarian, the apps, people would just back away from them. So apps certainly had to navigate the process of both present themselves as responsible entities that were taking actions, but also not being so explicit and authoritarian as Mark says, that they would push users away who wanted to meet. So that's very much about risk, right? And about trust. And we're now gonna go about businesses.
Thank you. Yeah, I've got it. Right, what am I talking about? One of our arguments that we're developing is around the ways in which apps as businesses promote the normativities of relating. And this is kind of evident in if one goes to their websites and looks at Tinder or looks at Bumble. So, for example, if you go to the Tinder, well, last week at least, if you went to the Tinder website, you find that their tag is dating, make friends, and meet new people, which basically was kind of in tension with how most of our participants saw Tinder as a hookup, sexual hookup app. Whether they were critical of that or not, that's kind of, that was a fairly common thing. So the quotations are the reviews that Tinder uses on its opening page is one from an alleged person who says, I was feeling lonely. Without the app, we may never have met. I will be forever grateful to Tinder. Another, my husband and I met on Tinder. Another, thanks to Tinder, I found the love of my life. We are married. There are other ones. So besides dating, making friends and new people, in fact, the message given is really a normative message about heterosexual marriage. But it's a message that, as you can see from this, is very much targeted at women, because women are the draw to the apps. And given that in the UK at least, 61% of men and 39% of women are signing up to the apps or using the apps, then that's what it's focused on. So it's quite reflexive, it's quite knowledgeable. It's not like an accident. So we would argue that they are marketed and structured through affordances in ways that bolster normative gender and sexual ideologies and relational values. The meet new people is interesting in the tagline because it's vague. It's absolutely ambivalent. It has no, meet new people for what? You can meet new people. So there is kind of scope within that to also invite those who are not looking for marriage to take part in the app. So they are sites where normative relation ideals and practices are in the main sustained at non-critical times. This kind of refers back to what we were talking about earlier. As askmen.com, that reliable source, says, there is some confusion about what Tinder is even for. Is it for serious dating or just casual hookups? The short answer is both. So again, that harks back to the idea of intimate options that are targeted at men. At the same time, they facilitate and further promote that cruel optimism, as Berlant would put it, of intimacy as an antidote to loneliness in the context of an increasingly individualized social world. So this raises the issue of dating apps as businesses. We've already touched on this, or guest speaker has, we have. So at the end of the day, dating apps as businesses are in the business of commodifying intimacies in their broad range of definitions of intimacy. Do you want to say something?
Yeah. So we have seen when we look at, if you go back, let's see on the other one. Nope, the other one.
Yeah.
When we talk about paid for dating apps data, there has been in recent years a transition for most dating apps of moving from their main revenue source being data and user data, selling that and using advertising, to relying on freemium models, having a limited access through free access and then paying for everything and paying quite hefty sums. And that changes the dynamics. For example, Grindr acknowledged this in response to one of the lawsuits, that they no longer relied on sharing data to make their money, that they were moving to subscription-based models, because those subscriptions are incredibly expensive for what they provide. We're talking £200 for Grindr for a year of the basic premium membership. That adds a different or an additional level of privatization and privilege that is required to access intimacy.
Yeah, I mean, we will touch on this again. So there are, following on from the risk discussion, there are technological and ethical risks to be taken into account then. So privacy, both from app companies and others who have access to app companies' data being manipulated and repurposed, for example, for revenge porn, outing people and so on, blackmail, for romance scams, and the risk of online consequences or offline consequences, which we mentioned earlier when someone was talking about the geo possibilities of tracking people and so on. So women and people of color experience particularly high levels of harassment. And there are, one might say, in fact, I think we would say, that the levels of moderation, do you want to talk about the moderation actually?
So if we go back to the argument that we were making before about trust and apps validating the information users provide, but also not being too authoritative, this is a very difficult pressure point for dating apps. So on the one hand, users complain that they can't verify what other people say. And as we'll talk later in the policy roundtable, some users said, "Oh, I would love if you had to prove your identity with some sort of ID when you sign up for the app," but they themselves wouldn't have been willing to do that. And there has been a move in recent years for apps to outsource their moderation and their moderating policies to countries like Puerto Rico. There was an investigative piece done for Grindr, where moderators are not trained and they are given just a few seconds to actually decide on these issues. Sounds a lot like when you ask PhD students to mark assessments, but I'm not going to comment on that. But when we talked with some of the journalists who had been doing that investigation, they said that some of the users who had been banned from these apps, who had no recourse whatsoever because they couldn't contact and appeal those decisions, for them, these apps were a lifeline, particularly if they were living in contexts where they were very homophobic, in the case of Grindr, we didn't have any other source of support. So apps have a huge amount of power. They have been portrayed as the only way of accessing sociality and intimacy. And they are not doing enough to satisfy users' demands for moderation, both to verify others, but also to enact moderation in a way that's fair and equitable. So it's very problematic. It's a massive pressure point.
Just to add a little bit to that is that, amongst our participants, and this is the idea of staying on an app, even if you're continuing paying for membership, even if you're unsatisfied with it or dissatisfied with it. The idea was there's no other way to meet people, which for the older people amongst us, me probably being the oldest, I think that's really interesting in terms of the social spaces, community spaces, and so on.
And there's been a change, right? So when dating apps started to appear, some of the writing around them was the idea that they would close down or they would lead to the closure of physical spaces, bars, clubs, gay villages. There's a paper called the Grindr and the Village or something that says Grindr is killing the gay village. Some of the arguments against that was that dating apps were an affordable way for people to access those spaces when they couldn't access transport, pricey alcoholic drinks, they couldn't get through the door because of racist bouncers, etc. But the truth is that now that dating apps are becoming increasingly more expensive, we're seeing similar dynamics where those groups who don't have the resources to pay for membership are being excluded once again. It shouldn't surprise any of us.
So, we don't want to depress dating app users, and as Jaime noted, the three of us have met our partners through dating apps. Jaime made me go on a dating app. I'd never been on one. It's your fault.
It's called fieldwork.
So they do enable new relational possibilities for individuals, but socially, as is evident during COVID-19, they did present a window, it seemed, for different kinds of gendered relations, or certainly more dialogical kind of communication. So they commodify love and intimacies. Oh no, yeah, we're there. How did that turn up again? Right. What's happening now?
I don't know which button you're pushing.
Oh yeah, no, you made me press the wrong button. He's so bossy.
I made you press the wrong button.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just one more comment about
Yeah.
Just one more comment about people paying for the apps, especially in the interviews. People seem to think that if others are willing to pay for the app, it makes them more serious to find love. Again, when I'm talking about people who are interested in a long-term relationship, and therefore they saw it as a good thing, and that therefore they were motivated to pay, and also thinking that people who pay are like a better quality kind of people. I'm sorry to talk about it that way, but that's how our interviewees talked about it as well. So there was also a motivation from the users themselves to pay for the app, thinking that they will get something better out of it.
But that only applied to apps where you could either all members had to pay for it, or you could see who had paid for it. Because apps where there are different tiers and you don't see who's paying for it or not, that benefit doesn't necessarily apply.
So what's interesting is, as Jaime said, there's a move to subscriptions, but one of our emphasis on subscriptions as opposed to paying for data or selling data, is that both Tinder, Match.com, which is one of the biggest company that has lots of different dating apps, has made less profit last year than it has before, despite the fact of having $3 billion turnover. It's one of its main competitors is Bumble, or the company that owns Bumble is Taboo and Bumble. And Bumble is not in profit, even though it has a turnover of $1 billion a year as well. So the question that some have recently asked, therefore, is why have people fallen out of love with dating apps? And I think Jaime's already talked to some of those reasons. Match.com, our Match Group, the owners of Tinder and Match.com and so on, has made a statement on the 31st of July to its shareholders saying sentiment has shifted as users seek a lower pressure experience with greater authenticity that more easily delivers desired connections. We expect Tinder to begin testing new lower pressure forms of discovery in the coming quarters, including more ways for users to use Tinder with friends. What's interesting about this is that there is a moment, not only a critical moment in dating apps, or such large groups of dating apps, the biggest companies, where they need to actually talk about users wanting greater authenticity. The implication being that they didn't have great authenticity before that.
So yeah, one of the things that we've talked over the past few days about this is the feeling that despite the statistics talking about dating apps being very popular and lots of people being on dating apps and meeting their partners on dating apps, there remains a huge amount of stigma on using and on being on dating apps. But even more so, that stigma seems to be attached in particular to being serious about using dating apps or even paying for dating apps. There is an assumption that yes, most people can be on a dating app, and have a browse, have some fun, swipe left and right with friends. But the idea of going and committing and putting in the labor and paying for a dating app and spending significant time on it, that seems to be still quite stigmatized in our interviews. Which goes again to this idea that the perception that what you're getting on dating apps is not authentic. In recent years, there has also been quite a few instances of advertisements on the subway and things like that saying, oh, let's say that we met somewhere else. I think it was Thursday, which is an app that allows you to meet people on Thursdays, that says it's less embarrassing if you say that you met on Thursday than if you met on Tinder. And Mass Match says they run a campaign that said, let's say we met in a mosque or something like that, because it's for people who practice Islam. So it's quite interesting that despite their widespread popularity, there's still a lot of stigma associated with them across both heterosexual and LGBT people.
So, I mean, one of the things here is about we were talking about this yesterday in the chat. It's interesting that dating app companies are putting this down to the decline in membership to the post-COVID environment, where people want to meet in person more often. And that might be partly true. But there is also a sense, I think, do we have a slide for that?
Yeah, next.
Yeah, oh, sorry. No?
Well, that's what we want.
For the care to answer that one? Okay. So they. Sorry, what was I saying?
Every day.
Such a boss. Uh, so the point being that it's not just about post-COVID environment. I think there is also that level of disappointment that we referred to earlier at play here, where certainly for some women, dating apps have proven not to produce the goods. And for some men, including some gay men who may, for whatever reasons, a whole range of social and personal reasons, don't get the goods either, whatever goods that is they're looking for. So I think the point is that dating apps themselves are at a critical moment where they're always trying to, as we said earlier, trying to reinvent themselves. So we find that Bumble is also, as well as Tinder, about friends. If you go to the opening page of Bumble, what you find is you can go for dating, but you can also get business contacts, which is like slightly odd. And so they're trying to resell themselves as multiple purpose apps, which they probably were always, but more explicitly. But I think also, and that's the point that you were making yesterday, is that the radicalization of the diversity of identity means that dating apps, even though the big dating apps are struggling, there are lots. The competition is huge. Neta and I went to a business. It's called the Global Dating App something. Global Dating Insights, where businesses, including the managing director of Match.com, was there, and people were pitching or talking about all these kind of apps that they were coming up with as well. She was saying at that time that Match.com are moving to a more kind of community, friendship-based focus, that Tinder was particularly going there. And there were all these kind of imaginative, some crazy ideas about, specific kinds of dating apps. So there's always this kind of thrust for innovation. Whether that actually pays off or not is a whole other thing. Neta, I think you're next.
So a little bit about the key messages. So I'm just going to wrap up everything that we talked about today. So we started off by asking if dating apps are indeed as transformative as some people in the media or other academics talk about, and can they be a significant player into bringing any kind of social change to the world? And as you heard about today, throughout the day, they do relatively little to challenge gender and sexual norms. If anything, I think if you're interested in exploring those traditional scripts about what men are like and what women are like and what sex is about, go to dating apps and you will get all the cliches and all the stereotypes. In terms of, well, we just talked about how they commodify intimacy and relationships and sexualities, and talked about how at the end of the day, it's a business. And we talked also about how they might not be a solution to ameliorate loneliness. But here I have to also say that, again, during the pandemic, there was a moment where they were more significant in that, but how quickly people kind of abandoned that idea and went back to previous patterns of dating and socializing. So as Brian mentioned, they kind of facilitate the idea of cruel optimism. As he just mentioned, the idea of you will find love here and you will get married if you just use Tinder or Bumble or whatever it is. So they kind of play a part in kind of sustaining that kind of norms of how you should find love and what that love should be like. And as Jaime just mentioned, there are still a lot of policy related issues in terms of the ethics of using dating apps, and also what kind of role do dating apps play in terms of data protection and privacy and safety, and in relation to health and risks.
But also, if we look at the idea of cruel optimism, the cruelest part of this is that dating apps, and this we see through the narratives of people we interviewed, create the narrative that the answer to loneliness is finding a husband or a wife. And that is the way to not be lonely. That is the way to progress in life. That is what you should be doing. They preclude the understanding of alternative forms of kinship and community making. And they propose themselves as the answer, the only way to find, the only way to not be lonely. So that is particularly cruel and mean on their part.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to that, not just to focus on marriage and relationships, but also they offer the promise of the perfect sex. You know, the sex that's going to, you know, are the rounds of sex that are going to, you know, guarantee, you know, provide some solution to the ontological insecurity that comes with, you know, radical loneliness, or and the epidemic of loneliness, as some people have said. So, I mean, ultimately, there's a cruel optimism of conjugal and stranger intimacies offered as an antidote to loneliness in the context of an increasingly individualized social world, which is another way of saying what you said.
Much better.
Thank you.
And in terms of outputs, we'll have more outputs in the coming years and decades. But so far, we've had a report that we did with Black Beetle Health, which is a community-based organization here in Manchester. We have the two reports, not the two reports, the two guides that are available for you to pick up outside. We did the protocol, and then we did, with some other colleagues, a paper on dating apps and health allies, and challenging the idea that we should uncritically embrace them as a solution to sexual health problems, because actually they may cause as much problem as they seem to solve. We have the 4 videos, which will be available on YouTube. If they are not now, they will be within a few hours, which are why using dating apps, how are they changing our world, think about using dating apps, and do's and don'ts. And we would like to sincerely acknowledge both Kian and Arek, who have been nothing but incredibly helpful over the past few months, helping us make sense of the quantitative data. The School of Social Sciences Community Partnership Fund, who funded our work with Black Beetle Health. Hazel and Christine, which are outside and were helping registering you in, and they've been fantastic. Also booking all the travel and trips and hotels. And our advisory board, Sharif, Susanna, Tom, Michael Brady, Catherine, Miguel, and Laia. This latest couldn't be here, but they've been incredibly helpful at helping us figure out our contributions, our questions, and our everything. So yeah, thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you.
Yes, so we now have some time for questions. Okay, let's start here, and then we'll go back.
Hi, thanks so much. It was really, really interesting to hear all of the presentations about the project. So my question maybe has 2 parts, and it's about algorithms. And I just wondered if you had any sense of what is the role of algorithms in how these dating apps are working, in terms of like whose profile do you get shown in what order on Tinder? And then the second part to it is then, how do the people that you spoke to, particularly I suppose in the qualitative interviews, understand that role and make sense of it? And I suppose one of the things I'm particularly interested in that is in this sense of how that fits in with kind of ideologies about kind of randomness and chance encounters when it comes to, you know, romance and things like that.
Neta, do you want to?
Me?
Yeah.
I just have very small anecdotes in terms of the interviews. The interviews didn't mention it that often. I do remember one interviewee, a heterosexual woman, who said, I wonder why these are the profiles that I see first. And she did mention algorithms, but I really did like, in kind of in relation to what you just said, how they said, I wouldn't have met this person otherwise. And you wouldn't met that person on Tesco either. But thinking how everything is like meant to be on dating apps was something that was really, really interesting, and how there are no other people in the world except the ones that are on dating apps. So, but many one did not talk about it, at least, and I didn't ask either. So they either, it was something that it was on their mind, so they mentioned it, but most of them did not.
I don't think there was a lot of reflexivity about algorithms. I think the idea of serendipity and the one being out there, I mean, obviously people aren't idiots, a lot of people know that they're going and they're looking for the best they can get, but there is also that romantic narrative there about serendipity.
I have actually my own story, because we keep referring to how we met our partners. I met my husband on OkCupid, and when I asked him, I don't know how long after we met, why did you talk to me? Why did you message me? I wanted him to tell me something romantic, and he said, you were the first person I saw on the app. And we've been married. We're celebrating
so the
5
lesson
years.
is to pay more to be the first person.
Celebrating 5 years of marriage this month, so it paid off. But yeah, so it's amazing. I thought he would say, I don't know, something about your eyes, I don't know, your profile picture. No, I was just the first, and he was like, well, let's just talk to this person and see what happens.
But
So thank you, algorithms.
But also not all apps use algorithms in such a visible way. Others just list profiles by proximity or,
Well, that is an algorithm, I guess, and that's.
but it's not as visible intervening who you talk to. So there are many different things.
Yeah, and in terms of the choice of the profiles that you say you're interested in, age, height, whatever, all of that stuff. The apps will filter it. Many of the apps will filter that to you, but they are algorithms.
Yeah. I'm interested as well, sorry to follow up, but how it may or may not be used in marketing these apps. I feel like when things like Match.com first came out, they kind of sold themselves as like, oh, we're going to get all this information, then we're going to match with your perfect person. Whereas maybe tying in with some of the things you've been saying, that's no longer a marketable narrative that people like anymore.
Well, the perfect person. Do we want to give the example of the recent dating app?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say that there is a sense in which initially some of the apps announce themselves as we have an algorithm that's research based. Now that has moved to we have an algorithm that's based on AI, and we'll use the power of ChatGPT to find your partner. But apps are also quite protective of their algorithms. We were contacted by an app from the US who they were pro-natalists. Essentially, their argument was we want to facilitate people to meet each other so they can create children that will be the future astronauts, the future athletes, and the future Nobel Prize winners. And they would allow you would use AI, you would fill in a bunch of questions, but some of them were your partner, what eye color do you want them to have? What height do you want to have? What body mass index do you want them to have? So essentially eugenics. So there is a lot about using algorithms, but maybe sometimes not being algorithms, just being eugenics.
I mean, again, when Neta and I went to the GDI conference with all the businesses there, and they were all very open. There was a conversation about AI, and really, I'm not sure a lot of people knew what they were talking about when they were talking about AI, how that was going to work. The only concrete example they had was of an app they had developed where you had a virtual person living in your house, and you would come in and you'd wake up and they'd go, hi, you awake? Have a cup of coffee, how's your meeting today? But they would actually know a lot about your life. So when you came home, they would say, was it stressful? How did the meeting go? That kind of thing. Yeah. So that was the only concrete example of, AI. Otherwise, there was just a lot of talk about AI as being the kind of future and the ethical issues of that.
Thanks.
You mentioned risk, and that is sometimes a word that's used in some disciplines that look at dating apps a lot. sometimes you go through Google Scholar, it's all you can see. Very annoying. But I wanted to know how you defined risk, because sometimes those definitions can fluctuate and I might have missed it.
I wrote it because I thought someone would ask. I wouldn't be able to make it up on the spot. So we define viral risk as practices, behaviors, and beliefs in relation to infectious disease taken by individuals. It's not the definition of risk itself, but the kind of consciousness of viral risk and viral safety.
Okay. Sometimes when you look at the definition of risk, sometimes some researchers will say this relates to infectious disease and sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes that can skew their numbers, and also considering risk as a spectrum, so like understanding that risk is more fluid. I was wondering how that might impact your data and considering that.
So in terms of the survey, the only risk we asked about was viral risk, both in terms of COVID and some other questions about HIV and mpox. In the interviews and in our analysis, we use risk both in terms of viral risk, but also in terms of all the other risks that we talked about: harassment, the emotional labor of unfulfilled expectations, the risk of meeting someone who doesn't do what you think they are going to do. So there are a number of multiple risks that people talk. At the same time, particularly for talking about viruses, we have tried to move in our writing from talking about viral risk to talking about viral safety, because we think that's much more productive than talking about risk.
And elsewhere, we've talked about, threats. I mean, like the intimate resilience. It's not so much the risk that's the issue. It's the threat or the perceived threat of loneliness or the perceived threat of isolation. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a very good point that we should be very attuned. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for your presentation. I was just intrigued because obviously there's a historical dimension to your data, and you said, some people have been using it for like 15, 20 years. Some people have been using it really relatively recently or since during COVID. But I think there's also like a degree, certainly from like, and obviously, as you said, it was very historically like a gay thing to begin with, and then it's kind of been co-opted and more widely accepted. Do you think that's because of risk as well? Like it used to be seen to be quite a risky thing to talk to people online and to meet people online, to nowadays it just being completely socially acceptable? And also has that been impacted by COVID? Like did COVID make using dating apps more socially acceptable, do you think, or not really?
It's difficult to say. I mean, I think, I do think it's less a question of, I mean, there are risks and threats are important, but I do think it's more an issue of individualization and where the individual is the focus. And I don't mean that like in a radical individualism where they're only concerned about themselves. That's not what I'm talking about. It's where people, the unit of social reproduction is the individual. So I think it's more about that. And I think it's not wholly respectable. I mean, that's the point that you were making about stigma, is that it's not universally accepted. It's universally accepted, perhaps, in gay cultures. But even then, I'm not sure it is, because there were many gay men who, well, let's say there were at least 25% of gay men who were looking for relationships and would have liked to have met someone organically. And yeah, so I'm not sure what the answer to your question is, but it's an interesting point to think about.
I think it has become more popular, but people love to criticize dating apps, both gay and heterosexual people. And there is, as I say, a level of stigma at taking them too seriously. I think the issue of risk, it's quite complex because there are many risks of engaging online, but some of the interviewees said, actually, I don't care that much about the risk of things happening online or about the risk of COVID, because as a young trans person, my risk, somebody would come to my house and hate crime me. I don't think that's a verb, but do hate crime to me. That's not even better. But there are different perceptions of what those risks are and which ones are more important at different times. There is, at the same time, a long history of stigmatizing online sociality. I'm thinking that online sociality is for people who are not good enough to socialize face to face. And we see that with some of the participant accounts where they say, I am the exception. Everybody else who's on the apps is a loser. I think one person in particular, we asked them if the dating app organized a face-to-face meeting of its users in your area, would you attend? And they said, of course not. That's a room full of losers and desperate people. But they were on the dating app themselves. So there's a lot of stigma flying around, both at the platform, but also at its users.
Also, another thing in terms of safety and stigma is that so many of them talked about scammers, but none of them have been scammed. So they kept talking about fake profiles, how people are lying, how people are this, but then they never experienced it. So again, I don't know if it's something that is just being blown up in the media or if it is something that is very present everywhere. I don't know, but it was amazing how, again, how much stigma they had against dating apps when they never experienced any of those things.
Yeah, but we had this conversation yesterday and I was saying, you know, you may not have experienced being scammed, but, you know, a lot of people will experience having, you know, people who look like they would scam you and you just ignore their messages. So, you know, the example I gave was the 22-year-old Russian guy who wants to have a relationship with me, the 63-year-old man in Manchester. And I'm like, yeah, right, you know. So there are, yeah, so I think there's an awareness because, you know, of the range of stuff you get on a dating app.
It goes down to poor moderating practices, which make it seem like this is prevalent and unchecked. Okay, we're gonna go. No. Okay, great.
I've got two questions. The first of which is regarding one of the slides with the qualitative data about risk management. And it struck me that there was like 4 quotes on it about negotiations. And it strikes me that the explicit negotiations are 2 Black interviewees and the implicit ones are white. So I was wondering if you thought about the racialization of risk management, especially in terms of COVID and racialized health inequalities. My first question is that. My second question is about like the future of apps and where they seem to be going. And I wanted to invite you in the keynote to kind of be in dialogue about that. You know, are we returning to are we trying to return to some of the logics of an earlier moment? Is it the same but different? Like how does like the contemporary platform economy and like the commercialization of intimacy impact that, like that move to try to turn to community? It's like 2 very different questions. Make what you will of them. Thank you.
Yeah.
No, do you want to?
No.
Well, the ethnicity question, honestly, we haven't looked at the data from a race perspective. Doesn't it strike me, having read the interviews, that there was that perception? Because lots of people talked about negotiating COVID, but a very small proportion of our interviewee sample identified as non-white. So I'm not entirely sure we can draw those parallels just yet. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't get your second question. I know you said there was a dialogue.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the keynote this morning, talking about like kind of earlier online dating being more community oriented. And it strikes me that the platforms from your description are explicitly trying to like position themselves as returning to that. So I wanted to see what you make of whether there is a return to that or if it's like something distinct from that, and to see what the keynote thinks as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think Sheriff said yesterday when we were meeting, or maybe this morning, or maybe it was a year ago, I can't remember. But Sheriff did say that, in their quest for innovation, I think dating apps try all kinds of things. And what things, I think that was the point you made, a lot of those don't work and they ditch them and go back to the thing that works, which is sex and relationships, unless it's something else. So I don't know if there's an interest amongst dating app users to engage with dating apps in the way that dating app businesses are saying they want to change the affordances and change the ways in which they operate. I think they are focusing in on community and groups and friendships, the dating apps that is, as a possible route to reinvigoration. But if you're looking for a relationship, or you're looking for sex, or even if you're looking for friendship, possibly, I don't know if that's going to happen here. Karen.
Well, actually, Brian, I think it was you, if not Jaime, and I wrote this down. Maybe there's something going on here about the limit to think about this limitation. So, the cruel optimism that you talk about is that loneliness can only be solved by marriage or long-term relationship or that kind of dyadic relationship, right? And I think there's an end to that sentence, which is, and it will solve it, right? So that what we have happening, I think, is this promise that your loneliness will be solved only if you meet Mr. or Mrs. Right and marriage, but then that's it. That this is over, and you should be satisfied. That loneliness should be quenched, and you're actually a failure if it's not. And I think that so long as you perpetuate that particular narrative, and of course that's not just the dating apps, as you say, this is just marketizing a long-standing kind of ideology of partnership, right, and monogamy. But so long as you're perpetuating that, the idea that you can then have a space that sometimes I date here, or I used to date here, and now I actually am here to socialize, that is highly problematic. Like, that basically runs counter to the narrative that they're spreading. So I think that the discourse that you correctly identify with this actually forecloses certain opportunities for a more diverse understanding of combating loneliness or some kind of sociality.
Yeah, so I think there's an inherent tension, which you articulated very nicely.
I think there's also a practical element to this. So the kinds of portals or platforms that Sharif was talking about as much more community oriented are very difficult to moderate. And we've seen that being a massive concern for social media and dating apps. Things like Facebook, JickJack are struggling with content moderation. And I think apps are doing so too. And in fact, when they appear on the media, it's often because shit is going down in them, and people are being racist, people are being hateful. The case of, for example, during COVID, Grindr opening group chats, which was something they had never done before. Those group chats were themed around things like Lady Gaga, rap music, your favorite board games. You went into them, it was just streams, but I mean streams of dick pics from people all over the country sharing them without any context whatsoever. It was great, but it was very difficult to moderate. And that's probably why they turned them down. So there are practical implications to it. And in addition to that, the stigma that still pervades dating apps seems to me to complicate the possibility of engaging in dating apps with the kind of commitment that would necessitate creating any sort of community space?
I mean, I do think that those communities cast as outsiders do, like, for example, there's an app for HIV positive people, people with STDs. And that's more a community app that, in my view, works, because people will ask, say, I've just been diagnosed 6 weeks ago, and some will respond, well, I've been diagnosed 20 years, da, 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 da. And you might get a date from it, and you might have sex, people are. So I think the more marginalized you are, or the groups are, and apps that specifically facilitate communications about those conditions, whatever they be, social, medical, sexual, whatever, do have some promise. And I wonder if that's actually looking beyond what we tend to think of as dating apps, and looking beyond those other apps to the, which are dating apps, really. They sell themselves as meet, your partner, who's also HIV positive or whatever. So I think there is a kind of a little possibility of a radical edge around the edge, actually. Yeah.
We probably have time for one more question, if there is one more question. Yeah, definitely. Can you pass your mic backwards? No, back.
Oh, back, sorry.
Hello. My research interest is the AI intimacy, especially the chatbot and AI sexual robot. That is my interest. And I was wondering, what do you think about the AI intimacy will be effect or change the sexual behavior or the intimacy behavior in the future?
We think a lot of things. My main thought about the chatbots that have been happening, particularly I think in Australia, there have been a couple that have been very successful, is that a lot of the problems that we see with dating apps are not overcome in those spaces. So in the Australia example, this chatbot was quite successful for some people. Then they rolled out an update overnight that changed the voice and the character of the chatbot. And people were profoundly heartbroken that the chatbot they had developed an intimate relationship with changed overnight, and they had no power in choosing that. So the dynamics of power do not change. And the dynamics of dating apps being businesses, whether with other people or with a algorithm, don't change either. So I'm not entirely sure they have the potential to alter that much the landscape, really.
Yeah.
And I love ChatGPT.
I mean, I will leave that answer to Jaime, actually, because I'm more ambivalent. But I haven't worked out my position on that, to be honest, and I haven't worked out. I haven't thought that through, and I'd like to think about it before I just kind of say something off the top of my head. Yeah, I suppose the only thing that I would say more generally, but it includes that, is that, if we see dating apps and we see AI and all that in terms of the flow of power, then it's important to think that, they're enabling and disabling probably at the same time, or they allow for agency and they constrain agency. So I think, as Judith Butler would say, we need to approach it with double thinking. It's neither one nor the other. It's both. And I think the reason I'm saying that now is that once, as a sociologist, you start studying something, you then start telling a narrative which sounds very like, these are horrible things and they're out to get us, you know, neoliberal, horrible governance. But I suppose I feel the same about, you know, AI as I do feel this about dating apps, that actually there are opportunities and there are constraints at play. But what matters is who has the opportunities and who is most likely to be constrained.
Thank you.